right. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Edge of Healthcare, Lessons from Leaders to Use Today. My name is Martin Cody, SVP of Madakit Health, and with me today, I have a gentleman that is the president of the employee division for a small company that used to be called Customer Value Store. You probably know them as CVS. So without further ado, I want to introduce Ed DeVaney. Ed, thanks so much for joining us today.
Martin, thank you for having me. Long time no see.
Long time no see is correct. Too long, as a matter of fact. So I think I want to start at a kind of a high level with some background on you, because you're in a very, very hot sector of healthcare right now. And I want to know how you got into healthcare.
So it's a good question. I started in 1998. I was hired to do consulting by a company by the name of Hewitt Associates. I was hired in to do defined benefit and defined contribution consulting. So all more pension 401k consulting. And if you think back in the late 80s, you had President Clinton, who was passing healthcare legislation, looking to make her pivot. The increased demand that came into Hewitt at that point was all health and welfare focused. Mm-hmm. So they sent me down to Houston, Texas to learn everything I could about health and welfare and group benefits. And after that, I became a health and welfare consultant for them.
And why the interest in consulting? Where did that originate from?
It's a great question. Growing up, I watched my father. Mm-hmm. And my father was a purchaser or a buyer for Walgreens at that point. So I always loved watching how the salespeople would communicate if I go to a dinner or a ball game with them. So sales was always top of mind. And secondarily, I was thinking about getting more into finance. Think about me chasing investment banking jobs, private equity jobs at that point. I decided the perfect middle would be financial consulting on pension and 401k plans.
Interesting. It's funny how when we ask folks what they do for a living and more importantly, follow that up with why they do that, it usually does relate back to exposure at an early age to some facet of that industry. And you're another case in point.
Yeah.
So your dad worked for Walgreens out of the Chicago area?
He did. Yeah. He had one employer his entire life, and it was Walgreens. I think he was there almost 35 years. And when I joined Caremark, it was, I want to say 2005, when Caremark had just gotten out of the physician practice called Med Partners, transitioned to double down on mail order and specialty home delivery. They changed their name to Caremark. And 07, CVS bought us, and my father was not very happy. I went to go work for the...
And my father hasn't talked to me since, right? So I'd be curious what the dinner table conversations were 07 forward.
I convinced my father to buy a few hundred shares of CVS, and I think I'll leave it short. He was much happier with the stock performance of CVS than he was with Walgreens back in the day.
I was just actually going to unsolicited add that. So I think he's much happier, especially in light of the last 4 years, certainly the last 2. So that's interesting. So now tell me a little bit about your role as president of the employer division.
Sure. So if you think about, we have over 50 of the Fortune 100 employers, but we also have 22 individual state government plans. Think of like state of Illinois, state of North Carolina, et cetera, multiple Taft-Hartley accounts, as well as small municipalities. So really everything that is employer-sponsored, even government-sponsored, such as the federal employee plan, that's all under the purview of responsibility.
And what is it that you, like your day-to-day, what are you tasked with at CVS in this vertical, if you will?
It's a good question. So I would say first thing I'm tasked with is trying to help the people that I work with day in and day out, how I can help them by removing obstacles and helping them be more successful. Our group is really more focused on sales and account management. So how do we go out and win new business? At the same point, how do we keep business with us? How do we align to what our customers' interests and priorities, strategic priorities are? How do we serve as an extension of their teams? And really kind of, for lack of better words, pull on the same side of the rope to drive the right outcome and measure ourselves, not necessarily against CVS Health corporate objectives, but but we have individual goals that are client by client, and we measure ourselves on our success of helping our customers be successful.
And do these clients jointly participate in the goal setting and KPI setting with you?
They do. So we meet with them face to face, or in the pandemic that was more virtual. But that is the key question, is we'll start each and every meeting saying, we understand your top 4 to 6 strategic priorities to be ... We align on that, ask more in-depth feedback, or try to get their response to what is changing, what is shifting, what is not, all in an effort to serve really as an extension of their teams.
It's great. And I would think, Ed, that your childhood experience of watching some of the interactions with your dad, and you mentioned, the dinners or going to the ball game and stuff like that, probably rubbed off on you, so that when you're customer facing, there's an authenticity in you and in your style and in your delivery that resonates with these folks that you can then bring back to the team. And which leads me to question, how much of your time right now is customer facing, where now that the pandemic is behind us, you're actually visiting with people, pressing the flesh, as they say, versus how much is it behind the scenes working with your team and helping lead them forward?
It's a great question. I would state, Martin, it's kind of changing or evolving. So last year I spent over 200 nights a year in a hotel, all of which was to be front and center with the customer. If you think about where we are within the pharmacy benefit management industry, we're at really an inflection point, and I needed to understand where the market was. So you saw me travel much more extensively in 2023 than I am in 2024. Now that I have feedback from our customers, specifically our client advisory council, which is driving a lot of the pivots in which we're making, now it's a matter of executing on that. So we have brought forward a new economic model. We brought forward multiple changes in the marketplace. If you think of biosimilars, I think that's a great example of that. Is on 4/1/2024, we made a really hard decision to exclude Humira, the world's most popular medication, in light of biosimilars. If you looked at the United States marketplace overall, there has not been a robust biosimilar market. We are the first PBM to ever add a biosimilar as a preferred product on our formulary. That's going back to basic law years and years ago. And we're keeping with being leaders of that by having Humira biosimilars being preferred. And this is a big deal. It's if you look at the cost of it, you're looking at about a 50% reduction in the net cost for members and the payers of healthcare, their employer. And it comes with an 81% price list reduction, which is another way of saying that's tipping to the marketplace that we're looking to move away from pharma rebates.
Interesting. And you mentioned PBM. And I think, as someone who has worked for 37 years in healthcare, and only 2 of those years have been for maybe 3 years, a publicly traded company. So always in the SMB realm, usually for entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurial companies are the smaller, more nimble ones that are trying to retain operating costs. And one of the larger costs, as you know, is healthcare expense. How do you work with those sorts of folks on overcoming their fears of escalating costs, of employee control, and switching plans every year? Because I have to imagine that is a very difficult hurdle, but a very real challenge that these employers are facing.
No, I think it's a good question. It's we actually study that in just about every customer meeting we have. We have an analysis that talks to leavers and stayers. So you think about people that were on the plan, stayed on the plan, people that were on the plan prior year but left, and people that are newly added to the plan. So mix is obviously an important element of that. When I say mix, is if you have a disease within a certain therapeutic class, are you using a high-cost brand to manage that, or are there low-cost generic? So these are things that we study.
Right.
We're consultative with those employers that you're mentioning, and then we go forward to those meetings with recommendations. If there's a bad mix, what solutions we have to drive them to lower cost medication, and then how we might communicate that change, whether directly through the EHR system, through the prescriber, because now we're embedded into the prescriber workflow. Many people don't realize that, but Epic I know you came from Cerner at some point in your career.
Not Cerner, all scripts.
All scripts. People don't realize that we're the single largest utilizer of Epic, which is the world or the country's largest EMR. And one of the distinct advantages we have in the marketplace is we're embedded in a prescriber workflow, which allows us to drive to lower cost medications because for the first time ever, we're highlighting to physicians the real cost of medication. So if they're prescribing a brand that has generic alternative, we're going to say, hey, for Martin Cody, he's newly prescribed, call it multiple sclerosis. Is they might recommend a high cost branded medication. We're going to bring forward 3 other alternatives within that therapeutic class that will be lower on the net cost for the plan, as well as lower cost at point of sale for that member.
And so this is actually embedded in the prescription writer within Epic?
Yes. And we're able to leverage that technology across all EMR if and when that ability or functionality exists.
That is an outstanding alternative from a standpoint. So then it's in the physician's hands where it should be, because they know your care best, to be able to make the appropriate clinical decision based upon the best information that they have at the time, which is perfect.
Yeah, I think if you look at, I'll take it even a step further, prior authorization, utilization management, of which we know is critical in this space. Employers are looking to keep down cost, but they want a rich benefit. And there are ways in which that we can leverage the EMRs differently. So the prior authorization is a great example. Is you get a prior, Martin, you got prescribed multiple sclerosis. We'll keep on the same example. So most likely for a high cost branded medication, there will be a PA, which is part of the UM. And in that, typically we used to rely on faxes back and forth to doctors, which is crazy. In healthcare, faxes still exist.
Healthcare is single-handedly keeping the fax industry afloat.
Yeah, it is. We operate a little bit differently. We're trying to get out of that. We're actually going upstream into the EMR, pulling down the lab values and prior prescribing therapies. And we're able to either approve or deny PAs right there based upon our ability to go upstream versus having the fax a physician wait, could be a day, could be 3 days, could even be a week for that to come back, all while the member's in the middle waiting for an update on when they can or cannot pick up their medication.
And this may be above both of our pay grids, but I'm curious because prior authorization is literally one of the hot buttons in healthcare right now, and it's the bane of most health systems and provider existence. It seems to be sand in the gears. Why do you think it is so integral to actually prescription fulfillment to have a prior authorization, and why couldn't we just rely upon the physician's clinical decision?
Well, I think it's a great question. What I have learned in almost 20 years in the PBM industry is doctors are well educated on drugs and disease states. They aren't necessarily educated on the costs of medications. Mm-hmm. And if you're a payer, if you're a large employer, or even a small employer, you want to get the best value for your dollar. The same way I would if I'm going out shopping for a TV, dishwasher, et cetera. So a PA is an opportunity for us to do that. Okay. That is looking at, have you, right now, I know we'll get into GLP-1s at some point in this segment, but those costs of those medications are about $1,300. And if you are an employer, you're going to want to make sure through that prior authorization that it's meeting the label of which the FDA approved the medication. Is your BMI at the right? Do you have a history of diabetes, et cetera? So you can check the boxes to make sure it's prescribed properly.
It's interesting because you're hitting upon something that I think is absolutely necessary. My challenge, and this relates back to something you said earlier about pivoting, that CVS has been pivoting the last couple of years and certainly in 2024, twofold, because the prior authorization in theory is an excellent vehicle or device to make certain to what you just said, that this is the appropriate use for this classification of drug. Given that it is data, provider information, if you will, it seems as if this should be done within minutes or hours, let alone days and weeks. How do we fix that part of the process?
Well, I think we already have. at CVS Health. We are a leader in how we're leveraging EMRs compared to competitors. So I think that's first and foremost.
Yeah, I think that's huge. As someone who sold EMRs for 8 years, that's impressive.
It's about time. That's probably the vision you guys had back in the day. And it's taken a while for us to get there. It was not a small investment. We made well over a $200 million investment into it, all around. If you look at what's most valuable to my customers, where they tell me we need to spend our time on, it's one, the economics. So we can now leverage our EMR to drive to the highest value product with the same clinical efficacy and outcome. Secondarily, it's around the member experience. So going back to the PA option, how do we remove the friction for members so it's easy for them? And last but not least, in a rapidly changing marketplace, our customers are pushing us hard right now. And this kind of goes back to what you're saying earlier about my career is while I do own sales and account management, I don't view myself in sales or account management. I still think of myself as a consultant. So when I'm in front of a customer, it's all around educating them on what's happening in the supply chain, what's driving up costs or what are headwinds, what's driving down costs or tailwinds from their perspective. That's typically where we spend the majority of our time being consultative. Then, once they understand the broader context of what's happening in the market, then we go to how we started the conversation on their strategic goals. And then we mix and match of how we might tweak them. So we're all pulling on the same side of the road.
Well, and it's interesting because you just mentioned a perfect segue for the follow-up question I had on pivoting. And you guys have made it in this particular area, $200 million investment, and it takes time. And it's one of my infuriatingly most frustrating things about healthcare is the speed with which healthcare changes or doesn't change. And I'm curious, given the size of CVS, how do you and what would you tell someone younger on the speed of change? And we all know the old analogy about it's easier to turn a boat than a battleship type of thing. How do you balance that with where the industry is going, what your customers need, but you've got a battleship of an organization that just doesn't turn on a dime?
So I do agree with you. Healthcare moves very slowly. I think what's interesting is I met with our client advisory council. Gosh, I want to say it was March of 2023. And we kind of laid everything out that here's where the supply chain at, here's where the market's at. Here are different approaches we can take to the market. They all stood up in solidarity and said, you guys had the size and the scale to change it. And without you guys changing it, it's not going to change. So you see us acting, behaving ever since that meeting very differently to a point where we have actually brought to market a brand new economic model that will be the most transparent pharmacy pricing model in the marketplace. And we have a ton of customers lining up for it. Honestly, Martin, without our customers saying, push it, do it, if not you, no one will do it.
Right.
We probably would have waited to see how it turns out. But I do think there's a level of being conservative, right? And we've kind of viewed this as an opportunity to kick the conservative boot and get out and be aggressive in the market.
And I'm curious, given your position in the organization and your history in healthcare, I look at some of these decisions at the organizational leadership level as actually kind of a lack of leadership in the industry. I don't see it so much per se at CVS. And I'll give you an example. I'm amazed at what I see in other industries and how fast these folks, even large organizations, move, pivot. They're very agile. If it's a mistake, they'll iterate on it and continue to evolve. And there's a leveling up sensation that happens over weeks, months, and years that seems to be much, much faster than healthcare. We've always said in healthcare, we're 50 years behind the private sector and type of things, even though of business. It still seems in 2024, we're 50 years behind the private sector. Case in point, the fax machine. And I'm wondering, is there a vacuum of leadership? Is there a collective CYA component? Is there just the overall fiefdom protection that people like their territory? And that's what's holding healthcare back as a whole from really the leaps and bounds? I'd just be curious your take on that.
It's a good question. I think if you would ask me this question yesterday, I'd probably have a different answer than today, but I'm going to give you my answer as of Tuesday. I do think leadership exists, but I think, when you start thinking about where we are in pharmacy benefit, you have the FTC looking into PBM. You have over 1,000 active state bills, all of which are challenging the ERISA and Medicare preemption. And we kind of stood back and say, there's probably a limited number of people that could speak to everything around the pharmacy supply chain. We know we have the expertise to do so. And when we open up that conversation to our customers, they were amazed about how the system really worked, what options existed. And that's when they said, hey, we need you to go full steam ahead. But that created challenges for us.
Right.
We're going at risk with, investing capital, moving to a new economic model. You saw what we did with biosimilars, right? We are in N of one on that approach. We have influencers within our same marketplace. So all the customers we have, every single one of them has a new contract every 3 years. There's a pricing event that happens on an annual basis called a market check. And, all of this has to be worked through the consultant. So it becomes difficult, Martin, when we change away from Humira, which was a high WAC or wholesale acquisition cost, high rebate, into a low list price medication, 81% reduction off of the list price of Humira to our preferred biosimilar, you're not going to get the same rebate. So then we have to work within the system across all consultants to say, look, this is how we model it, because you have to model to decrease cost of the list price of the medication on top of rebate. And those are all new learning. So essentially, when you innovate, you're adding more work to your plate. And we recognized it, we knew it, and we were up for the task to go out. So you asked me a question about where I'm traveling. I probably spend most of my time now with consultants, just educating them on what's happening in the supply chain, where we are pivoting, why we're pivoting, and then the math behind it of how we model all of it.
And I like that. It makes perfect sense from an investment standpoint. And you're right, those types of formative changes at mass, at scale, don't happen overnight. So you've got to go out and re-educate the industry. I'm curious, looking at Ed's personal skill attributes and, what you fall back on the most, what would you say are your top 3 skills that have really allowed you to persevere in a very complex industry and rise to the level to where you currently reside?
I highly value the consulting experience I had at Hewitt. Honestly, I think if they went public, then they traded, they sold themselves to Aon years and years ago. But I honestly thought when I was hired by them that I would have one employer and that was it. They were, in my opinion, the absolute best of the best. So that all had to do with, it doesn't make a difference what we at Hewitt want to do. Everything has to do with what your customer wants to do. So we've oriented our entire field within CVS Health all around being client-centric. Is we might have corporate goals A through Z, but if it's not aligned to what the customer wants, we need to be able to throw that out and align to strategically what our customers want. So I would say that's number one is, to me, it's all about the customer and how we make sure that they are delighted. Number 2 is I'm a finance guy. So I understand the supply chain, I understand the money, and I found a niche within healthcare that not everyone understands how all that stuff works. So I spend an inordinate amount of time upfront with customers, walking them through the supply chain, what's happening, the economic, what are, some headwinds and tailwinds, and how might they think about their budgets in future year. Typically where I'm at, which is probably not a whole lot different than when I was a health and welfare consultant back in the day in, 98 through 05.
Right. Long ago, everyone's going to apps. Everyone's looking for ways to hack things. Everyone's looking for ways to accelerate the stimulation aspect. And we're an immediate need gratification society, seemingly in the last generation and a half. But at the end of the day, I think the first point that you said is still valid, still resonates, is still paramount, really. And if it's, take care of the customer or someone else will. And if you make certain that the customer is successful first and foremost, you will be a happy customer will sell 10 times more than you will, because they're going to tell so many more people. So if you make that kind of your North Star for anybody that is getting into healthcare consulting or healthcare sales, the more time you invest in making certain that they're successful, you will become successful. I've seen it time and time again.
And I wholeheartedly agree with that philosophy. It's even going back to finance class in college or when I got my MBA, Warren Buffett's famous line is just delight your customers. And that's what we seek to do day in and day out.
Yeah, it's funny when you get down to it at its core essential. It's not rocket science. It's just, be good to the customer, help them succeed, and you yourself will be successful. I like it. You talked about a classification of drugs that is seemingly all the rage and might be the only thing hotter in healthcare right now might be AI. So tell me what you're doing with that and why it's unique to CVS.
First of all, GLP-1s has really come out in the last few years and primarily made by two manufacturers, in Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. So to me, this is personally the most polarizing topic that I've seen in healthcare. You have, I'll go coast to coast. If I'm in Silicon Valley with tech companies one day, the next day I'm in New York with the big bang. They're all talking about the need to cover GLP-1s to not only attract new talent, but retain existing talent.
Right.
If I'm the next day in the Midwest with the manufacturer, they are looking at it and saying, we think these are great medications, but we can't afford them. And Martin, I'll give you a quote. If everyone who could qualify for these medications took them, it would cost our system $1.2 trillion. That is not a small number. So if you're an employer right now, you look at that as a major risk to your business.
Yep. And what is CVS doing along those lines to kind of mitigate that risk?
Well, it's a great question. And kind of going back to the prior example is think of it as a continuum. On the far left, we're going to have as much price control and utilization management and PA as our customers want. All the way to the far right, if you're in Silicon Valley or if you're a big bang, that's a very different philosophy. Is how do we allow them on this side to get access to the medication, but at the same point, how do we make sure that they're in anti-obesity management, that they're following the protocols as prescribed by their doctor and in alignment with how the FDA approved these medications? So it's a long continuum. I think one of the difficulties of being in our company, you have such a diverse set of customers that all have different needs. Mm-hmm. So we can't build a one-size-fits-all. That doesn't work for us. We need to build a continuum and offer optionality to our customers in alignment with their philosophical thoughts.
Interesting. And one final question before we go kind of to the speed round. Sales, as you know and have learned over the years, is filled with rejection. Mm-hmm. You get far more no's than you do yeses. How has Ed developed a personal resiliency that others could learn from as it relates to rejection?
Well, Martin, I'm an old baseball guy. Still in my head, if I for every 10 times I try something, 3 works, I view myself as a Hall of Famer.
I was just going to say that is Hall of Fame material, and
so that's just built into who I am. And that's not to say though when you don't win. To me, there are more key learning when you lose than there are when you win. I think when you win, you need to celebrate. When you lose, you really need to go 2-3 layers deeper to understand what happened, why, what part of our process that we stood up worked, what part of the individual personality worked or didn't work. To me, it's right or wrong. I think to focus more on the losses to learn from them and hopefully alleviate them in the future.
No, I think you're right. And there's evidence to that supports that. And there's certainly, being an old baseball guy and, as you mentioned, growing up in the Walgreens era of Illinois and Deerfield and that whole area, you're familiar with Michael Jordan, and I'm not certain who isn't. But Jordan used to say famously, "I don't lose, I learn." And Kobe said the same thing. And so you look at some of these top performers, whether they are in athletics, whether they are in government, whether they are in business, and they will echo the same sentiment. They will learn more from decisions that didn't go their way than they will for the ones that did, because this is where the investment of work comes in, right? You've got to check your ego after you get a loss and sit down, and whether it's with a legal pad or an app or something like that, and write down, what did you do? And you really have to do a forensic excavation of what went right, what went wrong, and then learn from that. And I think it's through that personal self-study that the next time you are in front of a prospect, you'll be much better equipped to answer any of the questions. And you're right, it should go your way more favorably than in the past if you don't do that.
I'll even add on to that is now in my position, I have VPs, executive directors, all the way down to, new hire analysts. I actually grow more concerned when people aren't failing. Because if you're not failing, you're getting comfortable. And if you're getting comfortable, you're not growing, you're not developing. So that's a key aspect that I personally look at, is what percent of my people are looking to push the envelope, do something different versus now.
Yeah, because if you're not failing, you're not trying things.
Exactly.
So awesome. No, that is a great insight for anybody that is looking for a career in sales and healthcare. And basically, it's not even just healthcare. This is a career in sales. You're going to get rejected, but you can learn from it in any industry. I like that sentiment. It resonates as well. All right, we're going to come to the speed round. So we're going to play word association, and this is the one where corporate communications is literally going to be hanging on by the white knuckled. Legal sometimes has to call us afterwards. No, you're fine. I'm going to say a word or a group of words, and you tell me the first thing that pops into your head. We'll start with a softball one, because unplanned, you kind of hit upon this earlier. I'm going to say the word Walgreens.
I got to be careful on this. I think the retail pharmacy space is going to contract. You got about 70,000 retail pharmacies today. I think that number in the next 18 months or so will contract down smaller. I don't know exactly where it will be. I want to see Walgreens be successful. It's that's a company that I grew up with. I have a lot of respect.
Sure.
I know Tim Wentworth went over there. I do believe he's going to make some changes. What many people don't realize is pharmacy pricing today is cross-subsidized.
What do you mean by that?
So if you are Walgreens, or if you're CVS Pharmacy, if you're an independent pharmacy, it doesn't make a difference. If you are dispensing a high-cost brand medication, you are losing money on that. If you are dispensing a generic, the old formula used to be make up more than your fair share on the generic to cover some of the losses on the brand. And if you think about aligning interests or goals with customers, that was an easy talk track of saying, hey, we're all on the same page to incent generic utilization to drive down the cost of healthcare instead of brand. Right now that's changing, right? Now you don't have generic launches or another wave of generic launches. They won't hit again until 2026. All while you're seeing explosive growth of high-cost branded GLP-1 medication. So you did see CVS Pharmacy shift. They're launching it mandatory with CVS Pharmacy, not Caremark, and I'll get into Caremark in a second. CVS Pharmacy is realigning, or they're rebalancing to everything in alignment with how we are acquiring the medication. So you're not going to have that loss on brands versus generics. Caremark is offering true cost, which is doing essentially the same thing, but it will serve as an option for our PBM customers effective 1/1/25 and beyond.
Interesting. All right, the next phrase and first thing that pops in your head, Medicare Advantage.
I think Medicare Advantage is a tough market right now. It's if you look at Humana, United Healthcare, even Aetna, you have the MLR that's running awfully hot right now. I know all the analysts, both buy side, sell side, they're tracking that. Every earnings call is hyper-focused on it. It's interesting, the increased subsidies now coming to AGWIP versus the MAPD. I used to think there would be a massive migration from AGWIP into MAPDs. Now I'm starting to wonder if there's going to be migration out of MAPDs into AGWIP, where employers will have more control over those pharmacy costs.
Interesting. Next word or phrase, the first thing that pops into your head, this seems to be a relatively hot topic right now since we're talking about PBM, is Mark Cuban.
Well, Mark is doing a great job. He's out in the market. He has the loudest microphone, so to speak. Here's what I find interesting about Mark's model. He covers 2 brands and 2,500 generic. I already walked you through the cross-subsidization, right? So he's purposely staying away from branded medications, recognizing that he doesn't want to dispense any medications underwater.
Right.
Which is another way, the economics way of saying this is he's following an arbitrage pricing strategy. Is he knows that PBMs, retail pharmacies, everyone in the supply chain, even wholesalers are cross-subsidized. He's looking at it and saying, hey, I'll get this in alignment with my acquisition costs, and I'll highlight to the rest of the market where there are inefficiencies on the pricing. PBM traditionally always looked at market basket of goods, how everything is priced together. Mark, similar to GoodRx, is looking at specific generics and trying to highlight the cost differences. I think what's interesting is I talked a little bit earlier about true cost. And that is an option for our PBM customers to adopt 1/1/25. I did an analysis. We had multiple true cost deals that went out the door effective 1/1/25. And I asked our analytics team to pull it back and say, I want to know the top 50 generic, right? And how does true cost offer compare to Mark Cuban Cost Plus? Well, it turns out that Mark Cuban generics, when we stopped the cross-subsidization, he is 80% more expensive than us on the generic. But it's only a subset.
Right.
So we cover all 50 of the medication. He's only covering 44 or 45 because we know he's not covering every medication. And then one other stat that I think is awfully important to know, not covering the branded medication and not all generics. If an employer was seriously interested in Mark Cuban Cost Plus, he's only going to account for about 18% of an employer's spend on pharmacy benefits. So I do think while I love the competition, I love that he's bringing out something new to the market. I think that's always a good thing. I do think the angle in which he's going at it is not necessarily solving the problem that are really happening in the marketplace. If you look at generic spend, we created Red Oak, which is by far the country's largest generic sourcing entity, could be the country's or the world's largest. Generic drugs have been deflationary since 2015. So, as I am meeting with customers, as they worry about the economics of what you can and can't afford, the conversation never pivots to generic medication. The conversation is centered on high-cost brand.
Sure, absolutely. Yep, that makes perfect sense. All right, last question. I don't know if you're a wine guy or a bourbon guy or what your favorite adult beverage is, but if you could sit down with someone that could influence healthcare and that person could either be living or deceased, who would you sit down with and what are you drinking?
Well, I know you're a big wine guy. I'm not. I do see a bottle of Farniente back there, so that might be.
For the record, Farniente is not a paid sponsor. Go on.
I'm a bourbon guy, and I would spend more and more time with legislators in D.C., specifically in Congress and the Senate, as they look to make legislative changes to healthcare. I'm a big believer when government makes changes, there's always unintended consequences. And I believe the best way to rid yourself of most of the unintended consequences is to understand everything that's happening. There are loud voices that are not necessarily telling the full picture. My goal would be maybe 2 or 3 bourbons and get in depth on the pharmacy supply chain, how we got here, what is working well, what's not working well. I believe there's an opportunity we could educate the legislators that ultimately, when they do pass legislation, they have a full comprehension of the puts and takes that are associated with decisions in which they're making.
No, and you bring up a good point, because maybe instead of a lunch and learn, since you guys have got the size and scale to change the industry, maybe you have a bourbon and benefit where you sit down or you do it virtually, because they can't effectively pass legislation unless they understand the intricacies of the entire picture, not just a subset of it.
Exactly. And there are very loud voices, and pharma is backing a lot of this. And if you think what's happening with the pharmaceutical manufacturers, with IRA and AMCAP, it used to be pharma only negotiated with one entity, the PBM. Now they have to negotiate with the federal government on the Medicare plans and PBM. So we view it as they're trying to play a role in which we have less of a reach opportunity, trying to restrict the PBM, recognize they're getting squeezed in Med D, and then can make additional value in the commercial plan. It's interesting, when I am in DC, I ask a very simple question. If not us negotiating with pharma on the commercial plan, then who? Who else in the supply chain is solely dedicated to driving down the cost of a pharmaceutical product? And the answer is nobody. And I think that, while a very much an easy, basic question, I think those are the types of questions that get them thinking.
No, I agree. And let me know if you need some company on that trip to DC next time.
I'm there all the time. Join me anytime you want.
You got it. Ed DeVaney from CVS, thank you so much for participating in this episode of The Edge of Healthcare. Enjoyed the conversation very much.
Thank you, Martin. I appreciate it.
All right, cheers.
Bye-bye.